All right. Today we're going to talk about exporting your video projects out of After Effects. This is a very important thing to know because After Effects can do a lot of things, but it doesn't play back video very well unless you render it out. And you can't just save it and then send it to another program for editing unless you're using Adobe Dynamic Link, which still requires a lot of processing power on the part of your computer. If you're doing all your animation, like your finished work in After Effects, then you need to be able to get it out of After Effects onto whatever format your audience needs. If it's a client, they'll probably need you to email it. If it's your audience online, it's going to need to be a format that's really friendly for YouTube and Vimeo to upload. If it's for DVD, if it's like a master copy, they all require a different kind of compression and export setting. Okay, so the ones we're going to focus on are the web settings, because the most common are like YouTube and Vimeo and those places. DVD's going out of style real quick, so we probably won't even go into DVD formats at all. But then I'm also going to show you really good settings for a master file, so that even though you'll have your web version, which is somewhat compressed, you'll always have your master file that you can always keep forever. Keep in a different place than your project file when you're doing archives, because that way at least you have your master file and your project file in two different places eventually, so that if one drive dies, you can never really lose your project all the way. It's just a little security measure. Plus, if you are creating an animation in After Effects that's going to be part of a larger project that you're editing in another program like Final Cut or Premiere, you're going to want to export a file with as much data in it as possible, as uncompressed as possible, so that the editor has all the information it can possibly work with. So if you are doing other effects or filters and color correcting and stuff like that, then you got all the color information you need. Now here's an animation. This was the first assignment, and I'm going to create a few different versions of this. Now, what you have to do, you can't just export this as a video. You have to add it to the render queue. The render queue uses settings that are very similar to the Adobe Media Encoder, which we learned in the Premiere class. So the settings that are in Adobe Media Encoder will show up in the render queue here, and so that'll be really helpful. So the key command for adding your composition to the render queue is right here. Go to the composition menu, go to add composition to render queue, and the key command is Control Command M. Okay, let me show you what happens here. So I can do this in a couple different ways. I can either have it selected up here in my project panel, or I can have the timeline panel selected. Whichever is selected, that's what's going to be sent to the render queue. So if I do my key command there, it sends it to the render queue.
What was the key command again?
Command Control M. I use Command Shift ? They both do the same thing. Alright, now let's take a look at these one by one. Down here in the corner you have a few different things. Let's start and go right to left. Under Output 2, if you click on this word, not yet specified, if you click on this, that is your Save As dialog box. So that's where you can rename it something different. And I'm going to call this Fest Bumper, and I'm going to call this Master, because I'm going to make a master file first. Then I'm just going to save these to my desktop, because that's fine for now.
So wait.
If you guys are doing a project, then you're going to want to put these in your Outputs folder, okay, or Drafts folder. You could have a masters folder, you can have a drafts folder, however you want to organize your output files. So maybe I'll just create a new folder and call it output samples. And if I click save, that's going to be the name of the file that I export with this one. Now let's go top to bottom. Under render settings, click on the word best settings, and that'll bring up a dialog box. I would not change these unless you're going to be getting into converting files for broadcast or for maybe draft qualities, for compressing it for previews, for getting approvals and stuff like that, because it'll render out faster. So up here, I've got quality best, resolution full. These are the default settings. Okay, default settings are full quality settings. So I'm going to leave those there. I almost never go into the render settings unless I'm prepping something for broadcast. Okay, so under output module, click on lossless, and by default, After Effects thinks that the animation codec in QuickTime is the lossless version, which the animation codec is actually not a very good codec. I think that should be changed, but you can change it here, so that's probably why they don't change it out of the box. So if you go under video output, if you go to, all right, now let's start from top to bottom. Under QuickTime, we have, under format, we have a bunch of different settings. You can use QuickTime. QuickTime is like a wrapper. It's like a candy wrapper, okay, that has QuickTime written on it. But what's inside that wrapper could be a lot of different things. It could actually be, it could look like a Twix bar, it could be a chocolate bar, it could be a hard candy, it could be a jelly candy, okay? But QuickTime is just the wrapper that the candy gets delivered in. Same with a lot of these other ones. Now on Macintosh computers, the QuickTime is the easiest to use because QuickTime's kind of baked into the hardware and software, so it works the best. So let's work with QuickTime.
Is there a preference for PC?
For PC, usually AVI. AVI, or you can even use QuickTime, but the codecs are more limited on PCs. So sometimes you'll be just using H.264 files a lot, or MXF files in Windows World. So now under video output, this is where we do our selection of codecs. All right, under the video output section, this is where we select our codec. Now for a master file, if you're working in your Mac world, select one of the ProRes files. Now the data rate on the regular 422 is plenty high enough for a master file. HQ just throws a lot of data at it, so if you're doing heavy compositing or heavy color correction after you export it out of here, then you want an HQ file. Visually, there is no perceivable difference between LT, the regular 422, and the HQ. Visually, like just from looking at it, you can't tell the difference. Some people will argue with me, but you really can't. If you were, like I said, if you're going to be doing extra editing and extra color correcting, use HQ. But if you want to have a master one, go with 422, or if you're conscious about your hard drive space, do 422 LT. Okay, that's fine. If you're going to be doing nothing else with it, LT is totally fine. So I'm going to just use 422 for now. And then all this other stuff is determined by the codec. So that's okay. So if you click OK there. And then this is resizing stuff. it's going to take all of its settings from the composition itself. You just need to make sure that this is 48 kilohertz 16-bit stereo, because that's what audio generally is for video. So if I click OK here, I have now put the Fest bumper into the render queue. Okay, so this is like the most simple way. If you want to do one export and you want to do your master file and you want to do all other encoding in Media Encoder, then you just hit render and it'll spit out a file. Now if I tab over to my Finder real quick and take a look at this sample, now I can, if I double click on it, it'll open up in QuickTime Player and I can preview it. Okay, so there's the animation. But take a look at how big this 10-second animation is. It's 43.2 megabytes. It's too big to email, and it's only 10 megabytes, so, or 10 seconds long. So let's create something that's going to be a lot smaller. Let's go through all of our web settings. Now that we've learned how to just export one video one time with one setting, let's figure out how to do it with multiple settings simultaneously. So I'm going to select the composition up here in my project panel, hit Control Command M again, and that will put it back down into my render queue. Now let me resize my frame here so I can have more room to work. Under best settings, I'm going to leave that there because that's already the highest quality. Now I'm going to make a YouTube friendly version. So I'm going to leave it as a QuickTime file, only this time under format options I'm going to make it H.264. H.264 is very nice. Especially because this is a 720 by 480 video. I don't need to go bigger than that, or I don't need to use a different codec other than that, especially if I'm going to the web. But then I can go down here and I can actually limit my bit rate. So I can limit my bit rate to, let's say this is already 1000 kilobits per second, which is probably enough for that codec at that frame size. If I had a bigger frame size, I might want to go higher than that. Like if it was 1280 by 720, I might want to bump it up to 5000 or higher. 1920 by 1080, I'd probably go up to like 10,000 or 15,000 if it's a web video, maybe even higher. Just so you know, the ProRes LT, the 1920 by 1080, runs at about 40,000. Okay, so this is a lot more compressed, and it tries its darndest to look just as good, but it doesn't always. So H.264, let's try at 1000 kilobits per second. I'm going to leave all this other stuff the same because I want it to be the same size frame. Now I'm going to just rename this one H.264 1000. Now what I can do is I can add an output file by clicking on this plus button right here. So now I can create a second version, see how it looks. I'm going to bump this up to H.264, and I'm going to call this one wide because I'm going to resize it. And I'm going to bump it up to 2000. See if they look any different. Now I'm going to go back over to my lossless here because by default the system is using a codec I don't like, so I got to go in and change that again. Go to Format Options. I'm going to use H.264 again, and I'm going to bump this up to 2000 kilobits per second. Click OK, and then I'm going to resize this, and I'm going to resize it to 854 by 480. Oh, here we go. This is what I'm trying to do. NTSC D1 widescreen square pixel. There. I'm going to change this to 480. 861 by 480. If I click OK, now I'm going to have two different versions of this that spit out. So if I click render, it'll render out the first file. And now it's rendering out, oh, it rendered them both out. Yay. Alright, so now I have two more versions of this in here. If I watch this one, that looks pretty compressed, right? So if I look at the other, that looks a little bit better. Not a lot better, but it's a little better. Alright. Let's do another setting. I'm going to go up here. I'm going to add it again. You could also, if you wanted to, I could click on this and hit Command D and it'll duplicate it with all those same settings. So if I wanted to use those same settings again, I could now go based on those original settings. But since we're practicing the key command for adding this to the render queue, Command Control M, I'm going to do this again. So I'm going to go here, and instead of using QuickTime, I'm going to go straight to this is different than I would have it on my computer. Because if we, oh wait, so on a side note, look at the size of these files now, 2.6 megabytes and 1.4 megabytes. Those are small enough to email, right? They're not very nice to look at. Probably wouldn't put those on there. Honestly, After Effects isn't always the best compressor. So if I, for example, if I wanted to go over to Adobe Media Encoder, we have it. It's not installed. I guess I can use compressor just so I can show you. Really? Holy moly, it's not installed on here. I'll show you how another program would be much better at compressing. Okay, so I'm going to compare two different settings. One of them was using compressor and one of them was using After Effects. Here's the compressor version. That looks significantly better than the one straight out of After Effects with the same bit rate. See, there's the After Effects one. That's the compressor one. After Effects, compressor. Okay, a lot more crisp out of compressor. Yeah, use like compressor or media encoder to encode your files, and use that MP4. Use the MP4 settings because those are the really good ones. I'm going to pause when I'm done going through the next couple of things, and then we can look at Adobe Media Encoder a little bit more. Because part of the assignment is, you know, you need to make a file that is smaller than 10 megabytes, but still needs to look good, and you're not going to do that always straight out of After Effects necessarily. All right, so let me show you one more thing, a couple more things. You can set up presets that you can use. So I'm going to add this to the render queue again, and I'm going to go to the output module again so I can take a look at some of these settings. So we had the resize. I'm going to go to format. I'm going to do an HQ one now, ProRes HQ. So you can see how big some of these will get. I'm going to call this one ProRes HQ. Let's render that one.
You have to change the bit rate.
Well, the codec determines its own bit rate for the file. So the ProRes HQ is 64 megabytes versus the LT, which I called my master, which is 43 megabytes. All right. So I'm going to add another one to the render queue. And let's take a look at our presets now. Under render settings, under our best settings, if you look down here at the bottom of this little box, work area only, then if you leave it on that setting, then whatever is under the work area bar that you have set on your timeline, that's the part that's going to render out. Okay, so sometimes when I'm working on a longer animation and I'm doing my final output from an editor, if there's a change that comes to one piece of it, like a 2-second part of it, like some words show up on the screen and they just need to change the words, then instead of rendering out your entire project, which if you have a really complicated project could take hours, you just render out that couple of sections and then edit that into using your editor like Premiere or Final Cut. Okay, and then you do your exporting from your editor, which has better options for web versions and so forth. You can do the entire length of the comp. So if you by default don't want to have to worry about where your work area bar is, then you can create a preset that will make it so that it's the length of the comp, and that won't be the one that always loads in by default. Also, if you're always using, if you know 90% of the time you're exporting from After Effects at this ProRes LT codec, then you can create a preset for that and then have that be a preset that loads in by default every time you open it up. So let's go through that. That is these down arrows next to render settings and output module. So if I click on this down arrow, it already has some set there. But if I go to make template, then I can call this one full comp best settings. Okay. Now, if I click Edit, then I can go into this settings. It's the same dialog box as before, and tell it to be the length of the comp. That's the only thing I change. Then up here it says movie default, frame default, all these defaults. If I say here full comp best setting, then that'll always load in by default whenever I add something to the render queue. So I'll click OK there. Now let's go to our output module and do the same thing. Here are some additional presets that they sometimes think that you're going to want, but I'm going to go to make template. I'm going to call this one ProRes LT, and I'm going to put the audio rate in there also, which is 48K. I'm going to edit this, go to my format options, go to ProRes LT, click OK. It's already 48K 16-bit stereo, so that's good. So if I click OK here, and then go up to my movie default, tell it to be this ProRes LT 48K, I just saved myself a lot of time. I'm going to clear out the render queue now, just so you can see this. Now if I add this to the render queue, by default, I've got full comp best setting and ProRes LT 48K. Now all I have to do is either hit enter or rename it. Call it LT, click save, and then hit render, and then I'll have my file. Now that's the file that I would put into Media Encoder or Compressor, whichever one you want to use. Okay. Now you can export directly out of After Effects, like I said, but you know your quality is going to be much better if you use one of those others. So here's the one straight out of, again, here's the one straight out of After Effects. See all this choppiness and like this jittering that's going on here versus the same bit rate out of Compressor. Now, Vimeo and YouTube have gotten pretty sophisticated. If you have a really fast internet connection and uploading a couple 100 MB file only takes you a minute or two, then they can, you know, use their own algorithms to compress it to whatever they want it to be. But if you're uploading really long format stuff, then you want to get the file size down to a manageable size, and you want to have the quality be good enough. Vimeo actually recommends that for a 720p video file that you have a minimum of 5,000 kilobits per second in order for them to be able to say your video is going to look good. Because if you upload, if you upload a crappy looking video to them, the only thing that they can give you back is a crappy looking video. So that's why a lot of times when you look on YouTube for something and it's like a really old video, people haven't captured it very well, and then they haven't compressed it very well to re-upload it to YouTube, and that's why there's so many crappy looking videos on YouTube. YouTube actually is really good as far as their video quality goes, because they can take 4K files now, you know, and stream them at 4K. So the possibilities are really good. So the better looking video you can give them, the better it is, the better your work will get showcased. But like I said, if your video file's a terabyte, you know, you have a 30-minute ProRes HQ full 1080p, you know, you're going to have a really large video file, and that's not really practical for uploading. So you'll want to find a different codec. I've actually successfully gotten 2 hours of video at 720p to be less than 5 gigabytes and have it look really good. And because on my Vimeo account I'm limited to 5 gigabytes a week, so I know I can, if I have one 2 hour long program that I want to put up there, I have to like wait a week in between uploads, but I can get a really good looking video. And that's compressing at about 5,000 kilobits per second. So I'm going to pause here. I'm going to install Media Encoder, and then we can get into some of those settings a little bit more.